Good afternoon, folks. This is the last session of the day, so it's good news. But one more presentation, you have to look at a few more slides. So I'm going to talk about SaaS security. Let me try to understand the audience first. How many of you have seen Aperture, like either did a POC or using Aperture today? Anybody? Okay, about 5 people in the room. And how many of you looked at other SaaS security solution, like any other CASB players, like SkyHigh, NETSkope? Okay, few people. Good. All right. We do much better than those vendors. End of the presentation. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So let's talk about. Okay. So first, let's establish the problem statements, right? I mean, if I believe that if we are not in line with your problems, then the conversation is gonna be a very different conversation, right? So in terms of the SaaS problems, and when I talk about the SaaS problems or SaaS risk, it's basically, I mean, if we look at any organizations today, they probably have hundreds of SaaS applications, right? Few of them are probably corporate sanctioned. That's your typical box for file sharing or Office 365 or Salesforce. But what we have seen is pretty much in any organizations, there are hundreds of SaaS applications. And these are shadow IT. You guys heard this term called shadow IT? Yeah, anybody? Yeah, so hundreds of applications are coming in. The unsanctioned applications are being shepherded by individual users. People are using their personal Gmail accounts or box accounts and so on and so forth. We also see a lot of departmental apps. Engineering VP decided to deploy Git for 10 developers and IT doesn't even know, right? So in terms of the SaaS adoption, it's massive. It's exponentially growing. Right? It used to be 2 applications, Box and Salesforce, but now it's hundreds. And because of these SaaS adoption, because of this SaaS applications are coming onto the organizations, from threat perspective, we see malicious attackers that are attacking your organization through SaaS applications. So that's yet another entry point. You have insider threats. You have malicious insider people that are doing data exfiltration. But also a major problem with the SaaS adoption is accidental exposure. So it's your typical users who are using these applications but do not know how to use these applications securely and therefore exposing your organizations, right? So these are kind of like the 3 common problems. Now, if you kind of like look at what is the approach that different organizations are taking to secure them from these SaaS applications, the very first problem that they're trying to solve is the visibility problem, right? Again, it's the visibility problem we talk about as part of any Palo Alto products, right? So if you don't see it, you can't secure it, right? So the first problem that you need to solve is, do you see all the traffic? Do you see all the SaaS applications that people are using? It could be corporate sanctioned, it could be corporate unsanctioned, it could be tolerated apps, doesn't matter. You have to see all the applications that people are using and how they're using these applications, right? And once you see the traffic, once you see all these applications and usage, then you can make control, you can enforce policies depending on how granular that information is, that you are getting from that visibility, right? So if I see that 5,000 people in my organization are using an application called Prezi, and I know Prezi doesn't have a good terms and conditions, I might want to just block this application. If I see my users are using Google Apps, Google may not be corporate sanctioned application, but I have to tolerate Google Apps because oftentimes my third-party vendors or my business partners are using Google Apps, so I cannot completely block Google Apps. I may have to granularly control Google Apps. Maybe upload is not allowed, but download from Google Drive is allowed, things like that. And then for sanctioned application, you need much deeper security controls. Because the SaaS applications, people can access them from anywhere, from any device. So you need a lot more control. You need to know how people are using them, what kind of data is being exposed from the sanctioned application, so on and so forth, right? So these are the common problems that we see organizations are trying to solve. Now, in terms of the threat, just a couple of years ago, a lot of people would ask, really, I mean, do I really have to worry about threats coming from SaaS applications? And I'm just gonna give you 2 examples here. I think this thing came out just a few weeks ago. People use public cloud, people use AWS, and this is happening through AWS S3 bucket. The top defense contractor, left hundreds of documents, hundreds of sensitive documents with no password, right? About 60,000 files and 28 gigabytes of data were exposed from S3 bucket. S3, there is S3 EC2, Amazon EC2 and AWS console, but AWS S3 bucket is almost like a file sharing application. A lot of storage is happening there. Things can get exposed, and this just happened recently. That was a massive breach, if you will. And then you guys probably heard about the Google spear phishing attack. Anybody? Yeah, anyone knows? Yeah. So this one, this is a very interesting one. The Google have this app ecosystem. There, Google App Store, if you will. It's thousands of applications are there, and these applications can connect to your Google Apps, to either your personal Google Apps or corporate version of Google Apps. And in this case, what happened was, some smart guy, they came up with a phishing application, but they use the same logo as Google Drive, and then they use exactly the same name, Google Docs. And then as individual users, the end users were using Google Apps, this application popped up and says, can I get access to your email and calendar? And boom, this is how they got in. Hundreds of people were affected by this threat, right? So I think the point that I'm trying to make is 2 years ago, people didn't think that there were threats related to the SaaS applications. But now with the new attacks, with the new attackers, this is certainly happening, and organizations are, they need to do something about it. So we talked about all the problems. Now let's talk about the approach, right? So if you think about the SaaS security today, there are a bunch of CASB vendors who started providing SaaS security, if you will, started back in like 2011, 2012. And what we have seen is that they have introduced an overlay approach primarily being inline proxy-based approach. And we looked at those approaches, and we think that that's very complicated. It just adds too much cost and complexity into the network. And what I mean by that is this forward proxy-based solution is basically a proxy in the cloud, and the cloud proxy is the engine that is going to inspect the traffic. So you need to steer the traffic from your endpoint one way or the other to this cloud proxy. They're going to do SSL decryption. They're going to look at the payload. They're going to look at the content, and they will try to secure the content. That's really the approach. Now, the proxy in the cloud, it's simple because it's a service that they sell. They will just create a tenant instance. But in order for you to steer the traffic to the cloud proxy could be very, very complex. And this slide kind of like shows some of that. So the first step is you have to deploy an on-prem log forwarder so that you can collect logs from your Nextgen firewall or on-prem proxy and forward that log to the cloud. That's the step number one. Then For on-prem users, you need to deploy a VM or a machine that will steer your on-prem user traffic to their cloud proxy. If you want to create policy based on users, user groups, you need an AD connector that will talk to your LDAP. If you are already using a proxy, then you probably have to think about a pack file merge, because your existing proxy is already taking your HTTP, HTTPS traffic. So how do you give SAS traffic to this new proxy guys and then existing HTTP, HTTPS to your existing proxy? For remote users, you probably need an agent or another pack file, right? So as you can see, this overlay approach that a lot of CASB vendors are providing, it can be very complex. And this complexity, what happened? And if you think that you have to deploy this stuff one time, that's not correct, because it really depends on how many internet egress points you have. I've talked to a Palo Alto customer, very good Palo Alto customer, Nextgen firewall customers. They have 200 internet egress points, and they were looking at a forward proxy-based CASB solution. They didn't even realize that they have to replicate this 200 times. They need these VMs in every single internet egress points, right? And once you go through this complexity, the problem is it's still not sufficient. It's inefficient. If an end user using Tor, they will bypass all the proxy. So doesn't matter what you deployed, right? So again, when we look at this, look at the CASB market and look at this, some of the startup companies that are taking a proxy-based approach, we believe that that's too complex. And it's very similar to what we have seen about 10 years ago, right? Like if you go back in like 2006 and 2007, people wanted application level visibility. People wanted, to have policies based on user ID. Back then, they looked at their firewall, and the firewall was based on port and protocol, and that's all firewall did back in those days. So they needed a lot of firewall helper products in their security stack. They started deploying IPS, IDS, UTM, URL filtering, content filtering. So the security stack became, complex and more complex and more complex, right? And then with the advent of next generation firewall, they realized, oh my God, next gen firewall is actually doing all of that, right? If the next generation firewall is providing all this service natively, it gives you the user ID visibility, the application ID visibility, the functions within those applications. They quickly realize that they no longer have to go through that complexity. So then what happened is, about 5 years ago, when SaaS applications were introduced, as enterprise and as organizations started adopting more and more SaaS applications, companies thought that the next-gen firewall is not good enough, and therefore they have to look at an overlay proxy vendors, right? And certainly I can tell you that 37,000 customers that are using our next-generation firewall, if they are using our next-generation firewall as next-generation firewall, then they can avoid all this complexity, okay? So from approach perspective, what is it that we recommend our customers to do? The first step, if you are using our next-generation firewall, do you have App ID enabled? Are you doing SSL decryption? Do you have user ID enabled? And if the answer is yes, then we solve your visibility problem, because we can tell you exactly which user is using which application and what functions within that applications, what activities that they're doing within that application, right? We have, for remote users, we have Global Protect, and the Global Protect again is going to bring that traffic to our security stack. And once again, if SSL decryption is on, if App ID is on, and you are using function control and user ID, we give you complete visibility, and we give you lots of features to control these unsanctioned applications, right? So again, going back to the example that I was using, if I see a lot of people are using Prezi, and Firewall is telling me that Prezi is a risky application, I can just block Prezi. If I see a lot of users are using Google Apps, and Google Apps is not my corporate sanctioned app, but I see terabytes of data being uploaded, I might want to create a policy that says upload to Google Drive is not allowed, but download from Google Drive is allowed. Okay? So all of that our existing customers can do today with their existing investment. And this type of capabilities that I'm talking about, it doesn't even require an additional feature licenses, right? It's all built in, it's natively supported. The only additional piece that we recommend our customers to deploy is Aperture. Okay, so Aperture is a cloud-based service. It's 100% API-based approach. And Aperture, to secure your sanctioned application, Aperture is absolutely necessary. Why? Because even though our next-gen firewall is inline, there will be a lot of time that firewall is not going to see the traffic. If someone is using BYOD and connecting to your Office 365 from their home, chances are that traffic is not going to go through the firewall. And we need something in the cloud that looks at that user's behavior. So when they're home and they're uploading a very sensitive file in your OneDrive account and then sharing that file with a public URL or sharing that file with external collaborators, you need something that can monitor those activities, and Aperture is doing exactly that, right? So once again, it's a API-based approach. We connect via API and we secure these applications. This is actually a 10-year-old slide. This is something that we used when we launched PanOS 1.0. And what it's telling you is that when we released our next generation firewall back in 2007, the reason Gartner said that you are next generation firewall was exactly for this. From day zero, we said we are not going to let you create policy just based on port and protocol, because everything is SSL, everything is HTTPS. We will tell you exactly what application it is, what user is using this application, and what kind of activities they're doing within this application. And this slide kind of like builds that story. So your typical firewall, your typical firewall is source IP, destination IP, and TCP. And let me just build this slide. And this is our next generation firewall. When you turn on all the features, this is what we tell you. Okay, so we will tell you Mike Jacobson from product management is using a file sharing application that is hosted in Canada. The name of the application is SlideShare. He is uploading a PowerPoint document in SlideShare, and then in that PowerPoint, I see a string called confidential and proprietary. Okay, so when you have this type of visibility, then you can do a lot with that information when you have to enforce a policy. And then with the same visibility, all of a sudden I see my CFO Stefan is going to an unknown URL category in China and downloading an exe called shipment.exe. Immediately that should trigger something. So once again, this is natively built. This is coming from next generation firewall. And a lot of our existing customers to secure SaaS, they're using this platform. Right? You guys probably know about our application visibility report, SaaS application visibility report. So using those features and functions that we have built, like application ID, function control, the URL filtering, content filtering, and all of that. We have a native SaaS application usage report that we released back in 7.1. All you have to do is go to Panorama, go to PanOS, and say generate a SaaS application usage report based on last 30-day data. You get this type of visibility, right? We will break it down in terms of sanctioned versus unsanctioned usage. Who are your top users? What are the top applications? What are the threats that we are seeing within those SaaS applications? So you can get that type of visibility through a PDF report or the interactive dashboard using ACC. On the Aperture side, let me skip this slide. So if you think about Aperture and what kind of services that Aperture provides, at a very high level, it's data loss prevention. So anything that is happening in the cloud, Aperture is protecting your intellectual property sensitive data. The malware prevention, Aperture is fully integrated with Wildfire in the cloud. So what that means is not only Aperture can protect you from known malware, but if we see an unknown, Aperture can send that unknown to Wildfire. Wildfire will sandbox it. We get a verdict, and based on the verdict, Aperture can take actions. Aperture is looking at user activities and triggering alert based on unusual behavior, right? So if Aperture sees an excessive amount of download from Box or Salesforce, it will trigger alerts. Aperture also has machine learning capabilities, right? So over the last couple of years, the engine learned from thousands of financial and legal documents. So you don't actually have to create a DLP policy. When we connect to your corporate Box account or Office 365, Aperture can automatically detect that, hey, this is a sensitive legal file user is exposing with a public URL, right? You don't have to create DLP policies. Through machine learning, we already know that this is a sensitive document. And then Aperture can also monitor your third-party Google applications to protect you from that type of Google spear phishing attack, right? So the admin can whitelist and blacklist all the applications that are part of the ecosystem, and then based on these policies, we can trigger alerts, right? So this is next couple of slides. It's much deeper into this. Each one of these services from data loss prevention perspective. It's a very comprehensive DLP engine. You can write policies based on simple keywords and pattern matching. If you are one of those DLP experts and very comfortable writing regular expressions, we support that too. We support industry standard classifiers like PCI, PII, PHI, social security number, credit card number. So the idea here is that you have millions of documents in Box and OneDrive, and you want to protect those sensitive documents. You write a policy in Aperture, and you say, if you find any PCI, any file with PCI data being publicly exposed with a public URL, then quarantine that file. You might actually write a complex regular expressions that matches multiple things, multiple attributes, and then it also looks at the context around that asset. So if a sensitive file is not publicly exposed or not being shared with external users, that behavior might be okay. But if it is, then that's the problem that Aperture will bubble up as a risk. On the machine learning side, like I said, we have already learned from thousands of different data sets, different files. So today, Aperture can, through machine learning, Aperture can detect sensitive legal files and financial documents, and we are expanding from there, right? And also, Aperture gives you an interface for you to feed your own data so that Aperture can actually learn from your sensitive legal files, legal documents, and financial documents. Wildfire, again, our Wildfire integration is both for known and unknowns. So for knowns, what we do is as soon as Aperture connects to your SaaS application, we will get all the hash from all your existing files that are being stored there. We will send those hash to Wildfire. We will get a verdict, and based on the verdict, we take actions. So if Wildfire is telling me that exe is a malware, you can create a policy that says, go quarantine any malware that you find, and we will quarantine it. If Aperture finds an unknown exe or Office documents or what have you, it will send that entire document to Wildfire. Wildfire will sandbox it. It will give us a verdict within 5 minutes. And then based on the verdicts, Aperture can take action. So that's our threat prevention. From user anomalies and activity monitoring, for any application that Aperture is supporting today, we are basically looking at activity logs. We are getting that logs via API, and then we are analyzing these logs. And anytime we see something that is not usual behavior, more like an anomalous behavior, we will trigger alerts for admin users. Third-party app control, that's basically what I just talked about in terms of supporting application ecosystem and how do you secure your application from these third-party apps. In terms of the remediation, Aperture is not just a visibility product, right? It also lets you remediate those risks. It's prevention focused, so you can take manual actions or you can write automated policies. You want to quarantine something, you can write an automated policy. Aperture will take action. If you write a policy saying any document that has sensitive information and with a public URL, go remove that public URL, Aperture will do that. Aperture will automatically take that action, right? Let me take questions. Any questions?
Do you need to have your data classified in order for Aperture to work and have visibility to files?
So let me repeat the question. Your question is, do you mean the customer need to have data classification first before Aperture can detect?
Yeah,
No, the answer is no, because Aperture itself is a data classification system. You have to create a policy.
So it reads content.
Yes, it does read content. It goes through every single words in your document, right? So let's say you created a policy saying that I want to protect my source code, okay? Or I want to protect my customer data or customer's credit card information. You write that policy in Aperture. What Aperture will do is when Aperture connects to your corporate box account or any SaaS applications or Office 365, it will crawl through your data. So what that means is we find a document, Aperture will start scanning that document and look for sensitive information. It could be customer credit card information or social security number and so on. When we find this information in a document, then we also look at the context around the document. So if that document with PCI data, user exposed it publicly with a URL, or user was sharing that document with untrusted users, Aperture will trigger risk. Right? So this is how. So basically, to answer your question, Aperture itself is a DLP, the data classification system that will crawl through your content and figure out what sensitive content you have and how that content is being exposed. Okay, you don't need a third-party classification tagging system like Titus or for anything for Aperture to work. Make sense?
Yeah. And one more question. Compare, say, to NETSkope. NETSkope works with thousands of applications.
Yeah.
Aperture, to my knowledge, works with about a handful, and you have a whole bunch that you're onboarding fairly soon.
Right.
What's the roadmap for the product?
Okay, so your first comment about NETSkope works with thousands of applications. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, as a proxy. I do
No,
understand
that means App ID.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean Aperture.
Yeah.
Do you understand the difference?
Yes.
So if you look at our Nextgen firewall, the question is more valid if you ask that question between NETSkope and what our firewall is doing today. Mm-hmm. Because when NETSkope says they're supporting thousands of applications, they identify thousands of applications. And our App ID is doing exactly the same thing. We have about close to 3,000 App IDs now. Mm-hmm. What that means is when the traffic, if people are using Dropbox, our firewall says, oh, Moinul is using Dropbox. When Moinul is uploading a file in Dropbox, our firewall will say, oh, Moinul is uploading a file in Dropbox. Now you can write policies if you want to block that upload. That's exactly what NETSkope is doing. It's basically identifying application and identifying activities within that application. So that's not Aperture. That's really our next generation firewall, our inline CASB component and what it's doing, right? On the Aperture side, yes, we are supporting a handful, about 20 applications, which are corporate sanctioned application, focuses on different use cases. So to give you an example, see today if I upload a file in Box, a sensitive file in Box, Firewall will see it, but Firewall will not do anything if you did not create a block policy. It will allow that upload to go and stay in Box. Now 3 days later, I log into my Box account, I right click on a file, and then I share that file with my personal Gmail account. That activity will never come through the firewall again. So it's a very different use case, and in order for us to address that use case, we had to come up with Aperture. So again, Aperture, yes, it supports 20 applications via API today, but focusing on very different things that Firewall is not doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Understand the difference.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Any other question? No questions? Go ahead.
So you talked about Aperture is able to use words and look for sensitive information.
Right.
And I assume those words have been built over time. Can we seed it with certain words that are applicable to our organization?
Absolutely. That's, you would write a regular expressions or keywords or pattern matching. Yeah. So from the pre-built dictionary that we have, the predefined IDs, those are more common industry standard, like again, credit card number, social security number, international bank account number, and so on and so forth. But if you are looking for a string, if you're looking for a keywords, I don't know, Palo Alto Networks confidential, you just write a simple regex and Aperture will go and detect those documents. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So the question was, can I go back in time? Yes, we can with Aperture because it's API, right? So what that means is, when I connect to your SaaS application and we are trying to enforce a policy, that policy is not just looking at future transaction, but it will look at everything that you have in that application up to that point, right? So first time, let's say your organization is using Office 365 for the last 4 years and you already have 1 million assets sitting there. When Aperture connects, Aperture policy will be enforced on those assets as well, right? So it's first we do a retro scan, if you will, and then we clean up all the mess that you created over the last 4 years, and then all the policy is now applicable for future transactions as well. Yeah. And that is possible because of API. Because if you think about any inline, like today you drop a proxy or you drop a firewall, any policy that you create, that policy is going to look at the future transaction. It has no capabilities of going back in time, right? But because of the API approach, Aperture can solve that problem as well. Other questions? No? Great. Thanks for your time. I give you almost 20 minutes back. Enjoy it.